Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to take you step by step through the process of building my StewMac Strat style electric guitar. I'll give you my thoughts and tell you why I love this kit, and I think you will too. Although I have many guitars, there's been a Stratocaster shaped hole in my collection for some time. Taking it out of the box, I was immediately impressed with how well it was packed. I've seen children less buckled in than this. Really nice touch, Stu. As you can see, most of the work is already done. This is really going to be more of a finishing project than a full build. That makes a great fit for the budding luthier who wants to get into building guitars but might not feel ready to take on a big project. It's also a great one to share with the kids. Even my daughter was able to get involved. Now, that's not to say this isn't for a more experienced woodworker either. I don't always need to do things the hard way. It was a nice change of pace to have a smaller project that I could complete in only a few weeks. So let's talk about what the kit comes with. Inside you'll find an all mahogany body and neck, along with an assortment of parts, including pretty basic tuners and what I assume are stock pickups pre-wired to this white scratch plate. Of course you'll find all the necessary hardware, and they were nice enough to include a set of strings. Honestly, I have to say this guitar is closer to being ready than that Glary I reviewed. And it was supposedly finished. One of the nicest things about this kit is the instruction manual. This is one you definitely won't want to toss aside. It takes you through the entire process while remaining short and to the point. On top of that, it has some useful tips, and the color photos are a very nice touch. So, what's the first step in this project? Well, use your imagination. No, I mean really. The first step is to imagine what your ideal Strat should look like. A simple Google image search is a great way to get inspired. While you're at it, you can download some of those images and combine them in Photoshop to try out different options. After some back and forth, I was sold on this blonde finish with the tortoiseshell pickguard. Now if you wanted to, you could keep things super simple and just go with a simple clear coat or even a rubbed oil finish. But I think this guitar begs to be painted, and to that end there's lots of paints you can use. You might even want to pay a visit to your nearest auto parts store. A lot of beautiful vintage guitars were painted with the very same paint used by the auto industry. Duplicolor makes a vast array of lacquer-based paints that, although intended for use on cars, are actually perfect for guitar bodies. Of course, looks aren't everything, and to that end, good electronics are a must. I ordered these custom-wired Fender Tex-Mex pickups from 920D, which just happened to come on that tortoiseshell scratch plate I needed. Now I have to come clean with you and admit that I spent more on these pickups than the entire kit cost. Why, I hear you ask? No, actually no one is asking that. If you're a guitar player, you understand the difference between high-quality pickups and cheap ones. This isn't a dig at StewMac. They include inexpensive tuners and pickups to keep the cost down, and they know that people like us will want to choose our own anyway. With decisions made and parts ordered, it's time to make our first and last cut into this guitar. The Fender headstock is an interesting situation. From what I understand, Fender effectively lost any legal claim they had on the design of the Stratocaster and Telecaster bodies. That was down to their disinterest in taking imitators to court. However, the courts have held that they can still lay claim to the shape of the headstock. For that reason, this kit and many others come with an oversized headstock that you can either cut to the original Fender shape or come up with your own design. StewMac has this excellent template on their website for a generic royalty-free headstock. I printed it out and attached it to a piece of plywood, but as I was preparing to use it, I discovered that it doesn't actually line up with the version of the headstock they make today. After that minor detour, I did what I should have done all along and more or less free-handed it. With the shape penciled in, it's time to cut off the excess. This job could have been done with a handheld jigsaw or even a coping saw, if you have all day. But I didn't buy this bandsaw for nothing, so I'm going to use it. You'll want to cut just shy of the line so you can sand down to your final dimensions. Since sanding is as boring to watch as it is to do, here's some dramatic lighting. Another area that should be sanded are the ends of the frets. You don't want to go crazy here, you just want to make sure the fret ends are perfectly flush with the fingerboard. Also, don't forget to fill any chips or dents. After sanding everything down to 220 grit, it's time to seal the wood. I can't overstate how important this step is. Mahogany is notoriously porous. This sealer coat will keep oil and dirt from getting trapped inside the pores and ruining our finish. Before you spray it, make sure to wipe the body with naphtha to remove any oil or debris that might already have gotten in. Then put on a generous coat. We're going to mask off the fingerboard because this Indian laurel is naturally oily and will only get a nourishing coat of fretboard oil at the end. After the sealer, we'll wipe everything down again for good measure. To achieve a smooth finish, we need to fill the pores of the wood. You have a few choices here. StewMac sells a powdered pore filler, but you could also just buy joint compound for a lot less money. I personally like Aquacoat. To apply it, you rub it in and then scrape it off with something flat like a plastic card. Before we go any further, we need a way to support the body during finishing. I decided I wanted to use one of my tripods with a rotating ball head. That will allow me to angle the guitar any way I want. To do this, I made a block of wood with a 1/4 inch threaded insert. To give it some extra strength, I drilled the hole deeper and used epoxy and a length of 1/4 inch rod to hold it all in place. I fitted that to the body and behold, it's a thing. That might look a little strange, but it worked out well for me. With the body supported, it's time to add a few coats of vinyl sealer. At this point, I need to be honest with you guys and say that I'm not the authority on finishing. I feel like every time I do this, there's a certain amount of trial and error. I'm leaving all my difficulties in here for your education and enjoyment. One thing I find baffling, and I'd really like to get some of you experts in the comments to help me with, is this. Every time I work with mahogany, I end up with these little blotches, particularly along the end grain. Now, I understand how end grain works. It's like a straw, it sucks up everything. But what I don't know is whether it's a sign that it's sucked up some of the oil from my hands and that's affecting the finish, or if it's simply that it's sucking up all the finish and I need to keep applying it. My gut told me that this was a sign that the grain still needed to be filled. To deal with that, I rubbed in True Oil on the affected areas and sanded. The mixture of wood dust and True Oil makes an excellent grain filler. That, in combination with many more coats of lacquer, seemed to do the trick. You can actually finish the entire neck using True Oil, but I really like the feel of the satin lacquer. It's just so buttery smooth. Let's talk about lacquer for a minute. All the lacquer I'm using is color tone nitrocellulose lacquer in an aerosol can. What's funny is I do own a pretty nice HVLP system. I've used it before and it's definitely superior to the spray cans, but between working and chasing around my daughter, I find the spray cans are about all I have time for. A few tips about aerosol cans that I don't always follow, but you definitely should. 1. Warm up the lacquer before you spray. You can do this by heating some water on the stove and then letting the can sit. Warm lacquer sprays more consistently and is less likely to sputter. 2. Make sure you keep the can facing up. If you tilt it too much, it'll definitely spit. 3. After you finish spraying, hold the can upside down and spray for a few seconds to clear the nozzle. That keeps paint from drying in the tip, and again prevents the splatter. 4. And this is a tough one. Quit while you're ahead. When everything looks great and you think, maybe I'll just give it one more coat, stop yourself. That one more coat is probably going to be the one that some insect or piece of dust lands in. So when it looks done, it's done. Speaking of dust, can we talk about that? I kept getting these little red fibers on mine, and I wasn't even wearing anything that color. Spraying the body probably took about 2 weeks, and a lot of that time was spent going back and forth, sanding off a piece of dust or some other imperfection, and then spraying again. One thing I discovered is that I could use a piece of cardboard with a small hole in it to touch up those tiny imperfections without introducing new problems into the rest of the finish. That actually worked really well. I sprayed about 3 coats of blonde nitrocellulose lacquer on the body. After the paint goes on, you may start to notice some areas where the grain filler doesn't completely do its job. You could keep spraying and hope it builds up, but for some spots it's faster just to dab a little epoxy in there. Sand it away, and then it's time for more paint. I think I had my camera a little too close to the action here, and I got some overspray on the lens. Good thing I use cheap lenses for filming this kind of stuff. If this had happened to one of my expensive ones, I may have had a heart attack. With the color sprayed and the camera lens cleaned, I moved on to the satin clear coat. It's the same process here. Spray, look for problems, sand off the problems, and spray again. After some spraying and possibly some praying, I was finally ready to move on. It's well known that good fretwork is what separates a poor neck from an excellent one. Part of what you get in an expensive guitar is that attention to detail. To begin with, we need to make sure our neck is straight. To do this, you'll need a special straight edge with slots for the frets, or you could make your own if you're handy with an angle grinder. You'll want to adjust the truss rod until there's no gap. After the neck is perfectly straight, we mask off the fretboard and mark the tops of the frets with a sharpie. Next, you'll need a 14-degree radius block. This is one of the few special tools that you really do need to buy. Use some spray adhesive to attach 220 grit to the block. Next, sand all the frets until your marks from the Sharpie are just visible. The purpose of the ink is to show where the high spots are. To check your work, you'll need another special tool called a fret rocker. Fortunately, these are relatively cheap. The fret rocker is a small and very precise straight edge. To use it, place the fret rocker over 3 frets at a time and press down. If it rocks back and forth at all, it means the one in the middle is high. You'll need to sand or file until it's even with the others. Mine was pretty level, with only a few spots needing a touch-up. We now have level frets, but they're also flat. To play in tune, each fret needs to be re-crowned. There is more than one way to do this, but I like to use a fret crowning file. At this point, mark each fret again with the Sharpie. Keep an eye on the pen mark and stop when only a fine line in the middle remains. Be careful not to remove all the ink or you risk undoing your fret leveling. Lastly, we'll polish each fret with 400, 600, and then 800 grit sandpaper. Here I'm using a fret dressing file to lightly knock off the sharp corners of those fret ends. This one also has safe edges so you won't gouge the fretboard should it slip. Since we're ready to work on the body, I'm going to put down some protective foam and a soft t-shirt. It would be all too easy to scratch that beautiful finish, and none of you want to see me cry today. To install the tremolo bridge, we need to put in this anchoring plate. Due to the shallow angle of the hole, you'll need a very long bit. I didn't have any of those, but what I did have were these lovely self-tapping Kreg pocket screws and the long driver bit they came with. Again, to protect the finish, you'll want to have something in between it and the drill. The next thing to go in is the bridge. This step is super easy because the holes are all pre-drilled. When I went to connect these springs, I realized they're much too tight to do by hand. What you need to do is set the screws in loosely, connect everything, and then slowly bring it up to tension with the drill. For the tuners, I've gone with these Fender American Standards. They each have 2 little indexing pins, which I'm not really sure how I feel about. I like the idea that it keeps them from rotating, but it's an extra step that can be kind of a pain. To mark where these holes go, I lined up the row of tuners and then tightened them down just enough to make an impression in the wood. A small drill bit with a piece of tape will keep us from drilling too far. Once the tuners are in, it's time to move on to the electronics. That lovely set of Fender Tex-Mex pickups from 920D came pre-wired. That leaves us with only a couple of things to solder. The first order of business is to install our ground wire. That's easy to do. Just get yourself a wire, strip the end, and pinch it underneath the little tab on the anchor plate. After that, simply heat and add solder. Just in case you're new to electronics, let me emphasize how important this step is. If your guitar isn't properly grounded, all you'll hear when you plug it in is a loud buzz. Next, we'll desolder these wires and feed them through the channel in the body. Lastly, we need to reconnect all 3 wires to our output jack. I'm using a towel here to keep any hot solder from falling onto the guitar. With the wires connected, it's time to install our jack plate. One thing that impressed me when I first opened the box is that the neck came pre-drilled and well aligned. While you certainly could fill these holes and do your own fine-tuning to the neck alignment, as I've shown in other videos, it wasn't needed in this case. I think the fact that these holes come pre-drilled makes this kit a great fit for someone looking for their first guitar project. One small modification I needed to make, and you may as well, is to file around the edges of the pickguard. These often end up overhanging the neck pocket by a small amount, but it's easy to fix. One of the last steps is to drill the holes for our strap buttons and install the back cover. Final setup, while often overlooked, is critically important to ensuring this guitar will not only sound great, but play great. The kit even includes a cheap set of strings just for this part. Before we start, we'll need to install this string tree. The break angle of the Fender headstock is shallower than that of the Gibsons, making them less prone to snapping off, but also necessitating this little device to pull down on the B and E strings. The first thing to check is the height of our strings at the nut. To do that, you'll want to hold down each string at the 5th fret, and then measure the gap at the 1st fret. According to the manual, a comfortable action for the high strings is 1/12,000th of an inch, and for the low strings, 1/20,000th of an inch. Some of your strings will probably be a bit too high. To address that, you'll need to deepen the groove. Be careful when you do this because it's easy to take off too much material. The other problem you can run into is filing at an angle that's not steep enough. Remember, the string isn't laying in that groove, but rather being pulled tight against the ledge. I actually underestimated this a bit myself and had to go back and file a steeper angle on my high E string later. Once everything looks good at the nut, it's time to measure the height at the 12th fret. We're looking for about 1/16th of an inch at the high E string and around 5/64ths or 2 millimeters for the low. For this adjustment, there's a small Allen wrench included to raise or lower the height of each string. Now, StewMac also includes this little paper template you can cut out to help you get the right string radius at the saddle, but I personally didn't find this useful at all. Maybe I'm missing something, but I always measure the height of the low and high E's and then just eyeball the radius until it feels good to me. For the strings to play in tune, we need to check the intonation. That's a fancy way of saying we need to make sure that each string is exactly the right length. It's not really hard. You just play a 12th fret harmonic and the same note fretted. If the notes match, you're good. If it's sharp, which it probably will be, tighten the screw at the back of the bridge and move it further away. And if it's flat, do the opposite. Another important step is to set the height of these pickups. If one side isn't right, you'll end up with some strange balance issues. StewMac says to hold down both the high and low E strings at the 22nd fret, and then adjust the treble side to 1/16th of an inch, and the bass side to 5/64ths of an inch. Lastly, tighten or loosen the truss rod to set the neck relief to your liking. And with that, this guitar is finally ready to play. So, what's the verdict then? Is this guitar a good purchase? Should you get one? I would say absolutely yes. This guitar has quickly become my favorite to pick up and play, and the entire project, even with the upgraded parts, still cost less than a Mexican-made Strat and much less than an American-made one. If you're considering taking this project on, I would encourage you to go for it. What I love about this kit is just how approachable it is. You don't need a workshop full of tools or countless hours of time. Few things are as satisfying as playing a guitar built by your own hands. And for anyone looking to get into building guitars, I think this is the perfect entry point. With just a little work, you can have a guitar that you'll cherish for a lifetime. And just a note, I know it can be hard to get an idea of how an instrument sounds from a full mix, so for anyone who wants to hear the individual tracks, I'll link them down below. Well, that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe and check back later for more music and guitar building videos just like this. Bye for now.